Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast today. I'm really excited to have with us Kaito Cunningham, who's the CEO at Utopia Labs, which is one of the first companies to really try and bring up DAO tooling, payments around DAOs, and then crypto organizations. And so we'll talk about what that entails and then more broadly, the ecosystem. So with that, welcome to the podcast.
Really appreciate it. I'm excited to chat today.
I want to start off with your founder journey. Like, how did you enter the Web3 space and what compelled you, what possessed you to say, I want to be a founder here?
Totally. I think I have an interesting journey, and I think it actually overlaps a lot with like my co-founders as well. I was just a kid in college a few years back. I was always trying to build stuff. None of them worked out. They were all just side projects or projects that I was building outside of crypto. I discovered crypto maybe in my third and fourth year of college, and I started writing about it. I thought it was just an interesting piece of technology. And although I kind of thought about it from a DeFi angle, and I thought that was interesting, I found it really interesting mostly from this idea of governance and this idea of identity. So just started writing about it. And that was kind of the way I got into it. I was starting to make YouTube videos. I was posting on LinkedIn a lot, was having my own little blog, doing a lot of research on the side as I was going. And as I was doing that, when I posted on LinkedIn, and I actually met my co-founder through that, right? And I met my other co-founders through Discord and Twitter as well, just through creating content. And for me, what kind of drew me into the Web3 space was just this idea of having the permissionless opportunity to build. So kind of went heads down after that with some of our co-founders in terms of building side projects and hackathon projects. But I kind of came into it just through like a natural curiosity. I also found it quite powerful from like a remittance angle. So there's just so many parts of crypto as a technology that just interested me. Started writing about it, using it, and from there I just kind of didn't look back.
You talk about doing a bunch of failed startups and then content creation on social media and, being pretty public with your learning. Can you talk about that a little bit as a practice? I don't think that people understand how much of a superpower it is to actually do things and to do them publicly. What compelled you to try the experiments? Like, what was your process for learning? And how did you approach what you shared about them to people?
I don't know if someone else came up with this quote, but I might have seen it somewhere. But I think the internet increases your surface area of luck, right? And I think when you think of it like that, especially as maybe a younger person starting off their careers, the internet is probably one of the best things that you can do to leverage or just be able to get in the faces of really smart people, right? And just to get to kind of showcase those abilities. So I think for me, writing was just a simple way that I was able to actually make sure that what I was writing about was something I understood. Like, I found that to be something that's really magical and beautiful about writing, which is the fact that if you can't write and explain and describe the way you think about things clearly through writing, you probably can't explain it at all, right? And I think that's kind of the way I've been approaching it. And that's like where I spent most of my time in my college days, which was writing and thinking a lot about those things. So I think there's a really big beauty to it. I think I saw another tweet the other day that said like 96% of people on the internet consume and 4% of people create, right? I don't know if those numbers are correct, but I think it kind of goes with the saying that like if we spend our hours and our lives on the internet, there's some sort of balance between creation and consumption, right? And I think I spent a lot of time trying to work on the creation component to hopefully synthesize my own thinking as well. So again, writing is probably the key thing that allowed me to even meet my CTO and my co-founder as well. So I credit a lot of it to just this concept of building in public and spent a lot of time doing that in my earlier days in college.
How did you end up going on LinkedIn? There's just, people don't they don't love it. People love to rag on LinkedIn and how lame it is and so on. And obviously for me, it's been a fantastic driver of growth, and it's where people are buttoned up and sort of professional in the older sense. But like, how did you think of LinkedIn? And was it like, oh, I'm targeting networking, and so that's where I'm going to post, or how did it come together?
I don't even know if I had an objective. Like ultimately the objective was, it might have been even selfish, right? Which was just like writing things that I like wanted to like understand deeply. And therefore I just wrote it. And knowing that like by writing it, it helps me. It was almost just like that type of intent where I didn't really have kind of like this manifestation of a personal brand. I just wanted to put out content that people might have had feedback on, right? And to for other people to comment on and for me to kind of just hopefully get smarter. So I definitely see the rag on it. I think like the way I think about this is LinkedIn is quite kind of not in a bad way, but there's a lot of surface area in regards to just the amount of people, obviously, in all of their respective industries. But I think obviously with Twitter, it goes extremely deep, right? So I think that's kind of the way I think about it. I sadly feel like I should be posting more on both of those platforms as a founder sometimes, but just been heads down as well. So I think there's that combo. But I think both platforms should definitely be respected. And it's definitely worth kind of focusing on as a founder as well sometimes.
You get free distribution by doing that well. Okay, so that's how you meet your CTO. And did you immediately say, DAOs are it? Or did you look at multiple aspects of Web3 and kind of try to fit a solution to different problems?
Yeah, for us, we went through like a really good problem discovery phase, right? So like to back up a bit, I have 4 co-founders in total, right? Which is awesome. So I met my CTO through a LinkedIn post that I created and we hopped on calls. I didn't know he was going to be my CTO, but we were just hopping on calls basically every week. And then we started talking on Discord every single day. And then from there, we met 2 other folks, Price, our COO, and Alex, our CPO, through Discord and Twitter as well. So I met Price just through Twitter and then we hopped on a FaceTime and started talking quite often about crypto. And that was just the thing that got us going. Alex, we met through a mutual friend as well through Discord. And basically what we did was put all of ourselves in a Discord group chat. And the group chat was just talking every single day about crypto and things that we were finding interesting and potential ideas to build and kind of going through like a really fun, problem discovery phase. And for us, we actually shipped a hackathon project. This was like a live peer ETH global hackathon just to kind of get our first swing at building together, right? And for us, it was outside of the DAO space. It was this idea of kind of like a recurring NFT that you purchase that has yield embedded on it. It's through a product called Charge Particles. But we were just playing around, right? And we were just having fun building a bunch of stuff. But from there, we were kind of interested in DAOs and we thought that DAOs were a very, very interesting case study for basically organizations that are starting to live on the internet and what that entails and what that takes. And for us, we kind of came in from an extremely problem-oriented perspective. We were speaking to a few of the larger DAOs out there, digging into how they operate. And from there, we just noticed that a lot of the kind of their financial back office, what we'd like to call it for these internet organizations, are strictly run on Google Sheets. And I think for us, Google Sheets is a beautiful piece of software and serves really malleable needs. But we just came in and thought, hey, we could build a really great product that serves as a great UI on top of kind of the self-custodial multi-sig payment stack, which is Gnosis, and hopefully create an experience that allows them to facilitate these operations faster and better and cheaper, right? So that's kind of the life cycle of how we met as co-founders and we were starting to build on the internet. I wouldn't say that our co-founders and how we met were a DAO or anything, but we did operate on chain. We did kind of all join the space due to the idea of crypto being something that we found to be an extremely powerful mechanism. And from there, we kind of stumbled across DAOs as something that was an extremely interesting kind of group of organizations and just a fascinating concept as a whole. So started building in that space ever since.
A big part of my thesis on the space is that without a Web3 economy, we can't have decentralized finance being very fruitful. You end up with a lot of empty financial engineering, which leads into these recursive Ponzi loops, which are obviously a problem. And so you need a Web3 economy. And to have a Web3 economy, you need sort of these atomic units of value creation. And this is going to sound a little Marxist for maybe a little Keynesian, not Austrian enough. But like people put labor into various efforts, and then that labor is transformed and turns into products, and products go on markets. And that's kind of where you have value creation and capitalism. And so I guess my guess or my hope is that DAOs are sort of the small business construct of the internet. They're the way that people collaborate to build stuff. Can you talk about what you think DAOs are? Like, what are the different shapes of them? What are they for? And maybe examples of where you find something compelling versus where you find something like vacuous.
I think DAOs, just the word is very misconstrued in some concept, right? Like I would argue that when DAOs were growing, quite a lot in terms of like their market and new DAOs popping up every day last year, I'd say everything is a spectrum when it comes down to the way we think about decentralized. And if we want to unpack each of those words, right, decentralized autonomous organization, I think we can remove the organizational piece, but especially on the DA side, I think the idea of a spectrum is really, really important here, right? Because even in DAOs that we see today, a lot of them might not run fully on chain, meaning that when a vote is executed to basically say, hey, we want to swap ETH for USDC. Right now, there's a lot of DAOs that do that through Snapshot, which is off chain, and then basically do that manually, where there's an element of trust indicated there, right? There are some really cool on-chain use cases with Nouns and some other DAOs that are out there. But I think that's just the first thing to caveat, which is like, I think the definition of what we call a DAO is still something that I think as an industry we have to work towards, right? But if I want to kind of maybe zoom back a tiny bit, I think DAOs are an interesting case study for a few things, right? Like I think just this random thing that I had in my head was like, what has actually hit PMF in crypto? Well, it could be DeFi, stable coins, and one of them can also be human rights, right? And like the way we think about being able to allocate capital to needs that are or projects that are extremely valuable where people need it. So like one specific example of a DAO that I think works and is actually quite functional and is actually doing the right things and is actually operationally efficient is even something like Ukraine DAO, right? They're a nonprofit that has a pod structure that is able to allocate capital transparently and permissionlessly to causes that need it, right? So I think there's a really, really interesting element around this idea of human rights and DAOs that I think are things that I kind of want to explore more myself. Another way to think about DAOs is like, to an extent, the way I think about this is if you're building a transparent product on the blockchain, you need to have some element of a transparent governance structure. You don't necessarily have to be a full-on DAO, but even when you look at something like Circle.com's website, you'll see that their first tab that they have in the top right is transparency and stability, right? So I think there's some really interesting aspects of the fact when you build these transparent products, you need to have an element of transparent governance structures. There's a lot of kind of talks in the industry around this idea of like product DAOs versus like even just like this idea of protocol DAOs. And I think that's a very interesting concept. I think, frankly, none of us have figured it out yet in regards to what these governance structures should look like or could look like. There's some very obvious drawbacks in DAOs, right? In DAOs right now, whether it's just things like token holder voting to other use cases that I think could be much improved. But that's kind of my rant. Hopefully you don't mind. Maybe if I were to summarize this, it's just that DAOs back then have some elements of decentralization and have some elements of the autonomous component, but they're not fully there yet, right? And then there's a second thing, which is like there's some DAOs that have some use cases, and there's some really good conversations on if some DAOs should be product DAOs, right? Lido is a DAO that we support, for example. And they're supporting Lido, the staking protocol, and we think that they run quite efficiently given the fact of how much they've achieved so far as well. So I think there's just a lot of thoughts there to unpack. We're still figuring it out at Utopia as well, which is the fact that we believe in this idea of on-chain internet orgs. Are they DAOs? How do they look like? They won't look like what they look like, this year, next year. So all of those questions are things that we're even actively thinking about and fun to jam on as well.
Yeah. So I think the first thing just to unpack is, the word DAO is similar to the word project or the word company. It narrows you down to using Web3 and its economic architecture, but that's almost as much as it tells you. So it's an internet forum with the treasury of crypto assets, it's sort of a cartoon version of it. Or it's just a collective of people who are working on a blockchain anchored project and have a Discord. It's a very general term. And then just the same way you would say the word company, well, maybe you mean a 2-person partnership, or maybe you mean a 100,000 person bank, or maybe you mean a nonprofit organization, or maybe you mean an investment syndicate, or maybe you mean, as you mentioned, like donating to a cause. Like all of these things are human organizational permutations. And so the DAO part of it just anchors that permutation to some sort of Web3 mechanism. So you can have the variety of economic activity. The place where I wanted to double click with you is you had mentioned a DAO using a pod structure. And like in my mind, the really early innovators around DAOs were things like the Airborne operating system, right? And this was coming out of 2017, 2018 thinking, where it was like, let's be really opinionated and code everything about governance into a software platform on chain. And that's how all of these things are going to function. It was so science fiction and futuristic and interesting, but when you project it forward, it was sort of like missed the mark, where most of the DAOs ended up being these sort of like amorphous communities and then bolted off like one-off tools rather than using one platform. And of course, now it's shifting again. And there are some templates for how we're organized, including kind of like the pod structure or like the fractal DAOs that Maker's talking about. So can you talk a little bit about your view on like why that early platform approach maybe missed the mark? And then what are some of the templates that have emerged?
For sure. Whenever I say pods, by the way, I think it's worth shouting out like Metropolis and what they've worked on to really think about that. I think Vitalik has also talked about that in DAOs as well within his blog post. But yeah, I think platforms, I think maybe my take is I'm also a really big fan of Aragon, like what they've built. A lot of DAOs kind of started their treasury through that and are either still using it or have migrated to Gnosis Safe, right? And I think it's just this general thought of like this idea of composability, modularity, and all of these themes that a lot of people in crypto talk about. But I think, we're a wrapper and a product built on top of Gnosis Safe. And we're really grateful for the Gnosis Safe team for kind of opening up those APIs and making it very easy for us to create a beautiful experience on top of their SDKs, right? So I think the general thought is like if you're building a platform in an extremely early stage ambiguous market, it's quite hard potentially. And the only reason why I say that is because things change so often. There's these best practices being established to this day, right? Even 6 months ago to a year, I'm assuming that this idea of pods and working groups were not things that were implemented as heavily as they are right now in crypto and DAOs today, right? Like even when we started our company back in late 2021 and early January of last year, we didn't see too many ideas of this idea of working groups as much as they're prevalent today, right? So, I think the general thesis behind this idea is just like being able to create autonomy, being able to get rid of a degree of information asymmetry and making sure that there's certain people really focused on one problem and several problems within the org. But I think platform approaches are just generally very, very hard in an ambiguous market in which DAOs are, right? So I think DAOs are also special because there's this idea of liquid labor and liquid capital. And I think it's very hard to build software if a lot of the things there are liquid, right? So I think that's just the general way I think about it.
What does that mean?
Liquid labor, I think it's just the general construct of the fact that these individuals who participate in these internet communities and capture some of the upside of participating in it are basically able to leave anytime, right? There's some senses of no contractual agreement, even though it could be done off-chain, so to say, or it could be done through some sort of vesting parameter. But in some sources, right, like if you're contributing to an internet community, it's not like your typical employment career where you have kind of like this opportunity cost of leaving as much. It's not as sticky, right? So, I think that's like the way I think about liquid labor is basically the freedom to feel employed basically at any point in time and just to go in and permissionlessly contribute. Keep in mind, this idea of being able to permissionlessly contribute has its challenges as well, right? Like a lot of people right now, specifically in DAO land, are thinking a bit about the trade-off of bounties, right? So even a year ago, bounties were things that were extremely prevalent and popular. DAOs were thinking about how they could activate this idea of like their contributor funnel, which was basically maybe a token holder. If you go one layer down in the funnel, it might be like a part-time contributor. And then, ideally you want them to be core contributors or people who kind of commit to the protocol, right? And I think bounties were a really good way of activating kind of the token holder to part-time aspect. And, we're starting to see kind of just challenges behind that, right? Like it's really hard to ask for someone who doesn't know about a project or just knows briefly about a project to be able to do their best work and permissionlessly contribute just because there's a lack of context, right? So, that's kind of like the way I think about it. And that's why I think DAOs and internet orgs are kind of special in that context. Again, there's just so many things we need to work on to improve these types of organizational structures. But yeah, I think that's the concept of like what I would say with liquid labor.
I'm still super interested in like the shift in the last 6 months. And I think looking at something like Maker and the restructuring of Maker, as a symptom is one direction we could go, sort of shifting towards more on-chain assets or shifting towards kind of like more functional separation. How would you characterize the last 6 months of governance structure evolution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Governance structure, yeah, it's very interesting, right? Like I think My just general take is that like over time, to an extent with crypto protocols, you should transition and eventually move to some sort of decentralized model. That's kind of an opinionated take, and it doesn't have to apply to every single project out there, right? But governance structure evolution is interesting. We're starting to see some of the drawbacks potentially of things like token holder voting and the fact that there's a certain concentration of voting. Another thing that's wrong that we've seen with governance is this idea of consensus driven decision making. There's a really good podcast by Reverie and I believe with Hasu from Lido as well that talks a bit about this idea of like, in some senses, like, companies should run relatively like authoritarian, where there should be a few decision makers that are able to make decisions quite quickly, while maybe countries should also be, these are all just like kind of like this idea of political science, right? And I'm no expert in that, but, basically at a high level, what I'm trying to say is that there's a few experiments in DAOs that I think have been very difficult. One is token holder voting. Two is this idea of consensus driven decision making. I think it's really hard, right? Like if you have a bunch of token holders voting on something, it's definitely not their fault, but they lack the context that certain core contributors might have. And some of the core contributors might feel extremely frustrated when they have to explain something with an extremely long essay on why they should do something. Right. And the incentives aren't there either, right? It's not simply just token holders and core contributors, but within token holders, they have different levels of incentives, right? And basically it kind of encourages this idea of potentially short-termism. So I think governance, another one is like even just this idea of involvement, right? Like just in like my municipality elections in Vancouver, Canada, I believe only like 11 to 15%, and again, that number might be wrong, but it's quite low, participate in voting for like the local mayor. Right. I think DAOs are quite similar in terms of that metric. Right. And there's tons of just fun things to think about there. But I'd say those are 3 to 4 involvements that I think have been, quite prevalent in regards to things that we need to solve. Like another one is even this idea of off-chain and social influence. So like a good one is like, let's just say, Lex, you are a person that's been contributing to MakerDAO for a really long time, and you vote on something and people are able to see that you voted on something without needing or without digging in myself. I might just vote because you voted for something, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, because I think obviously you might be the expert in that space, but there's also this element of like what Nouns is doing right now, which is we're really working on this idea of ZK voting, basically similar to how democracy operates today, right? Like, if I put in a vote for the next president or the next, prime minister in Canada, my mom doesn't necessarily get to see who voted on TV, right? It doesn't say Kaito Cunningham voted for X, right? So there's just tons of drawbacks that we're seeing. It's almost like you should reference history to make better kind of models for the future. And I think that's kind of where the stage we're at today. And it's actually quite exciting because the amount of experiments that are in this space regarding delegation, regarding how councils work, regarding how committees work, Optimism is doing tons of interesting work in governance. I think it's a really fun space to build in, right? Even JokeDAO, even this idea of bottoms up, collaborative community decision making rather than this idea of top down DAO decision making. Sorry for speaking so long, but I actually think it's fascinating, right? I think it's fascinating because, it's going to be a piece of technology and it's going to be things that even 2 to 5 years from now, it's going to be a way in which internet communities collaborate, right? So I'll stop there, but I think definitely wanted to be a bit more clear in the way I describe those things. But those are just kind of like a brain rant or a brain dump of everything I've seen in governance so far working with some of these communities.
Often crypto gets criticized for repeating the mistakes of the past over and over again. And I don't think that's a fruitful criticism because on the one hand, yes, between 2017 and 2023, the space has managed to recreate, the tulip mania, the internet crash, and the Lehman financial crisis. That's just human nature. We've shown that people can be driven by animal spirits, and that's the Great Depression in 29. We've shown that if you've got lots of incentive issues and conflicts of interests with SBF and FTX, you end up making horrible decisions and choosing fraud instead of not choosing fraud. Those are very painful, but at the same time, that history of financial mistakes happened within 5 years. And then the answer to those mistakes is encoded not into law, which is a fine sort of processing medium, but is a very slow processing medium, right? So law finds exceptions and then incorporates them into black letter law, which is just a set of like fuzzy instructions through language. And instead, it's immediate response by the industry encoded into software with things like proofs of reserves for custodial crypto exchanges, with things like on-chain finance instead of custodial finance, and so on and so forth. And this gets litigated in actual software building and then in the markets around it. And I think the same thing can be said for politics and governance. And so if we think about more broadly, like our society being uploaded and digitized, and that kind of the next step post-economy is much more clearly digitizing our socioeconomics and our hierarchies and our politics and our engagements with that. Absolutely, the political units or the socioeconomic units in Web3 are going to drive through literally every mistake. Like they're going to drive through first the Hobbesian nightmare of everybody is out to kill everybody else and we're all alone, right? Like the tribes of degen traders is very much sort of like the ravaging warlords. And then you end up with the mistakes of monarchy and priesthood, the one leader that knows all the answers and the priesthood that's there to support the religion. You see that in lots of different places in the space. And then you get the mistake of like a landed gentry or like an oligarchy through nobility and financial means, right? So people that Andreessen and others who hold lots of the financial assets of the protocol and therefore are able to rule it as a result. And, things are now kind of converging into different organizational structures that are a little bit more modern, that look more like the organizational structures of kind of modern management techniques and tech companies. You're playing around with the idea of voting driven by identity and the individual human and democracy rather than by financial holding. And then you have like the politics of including stakeholders that are not just the financial owners, but also the customers and so on. And so you're getting into like corporate governance. And so to me, the fact that we're kind of steamrolling through all of these millennia of human like politics and governance history, and we're doing it in a span of like 3 years and then building software tooling to support it is really profound. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's like the digitization process.
Totally. I really appreciate those thoughts because I think this idea of regulation by enforcement, this idea of regulation at the nation state level is something that I think a lot of people in crypto want in terms of clarity. Like the way I think about this is there needs to be kind of placeholders throughout that meantime for this idea of regulation by community. And I think, still kind of grappling with what that means to a further degree. But I think the general thought is ideally crypto can hold itself to some degree of standards in regards to being able to be regulated, not necessarily from like a nation state angle potentially, but even just from like this idea of code, right? And I think we're starting to do that with open source. We've done that since the early days of crypto as well. But even just this idea of transparency and verifiability, a lot of those things are things that I think are still things that are needed in the space, right? I think crypto as an industry needs to hold itself to a higher standard. I think a lot of DAOs should hold themselves to a high standard in regards to how they kind of display their financial activity or, think about voting and a lot of those things, right? That kind of need to be transparent from the get-go. So I appreciate those thoughts. And I think it is, I haven't even thought of it like that, but it's quite cool to see even 100 years of history kind of being all packaged in to one specific industry, being able to draw parallels and then hopefully being able to go back to the drawing board and continuously experiment, right? Because I think like a few other things is like some of the things that we might not talk about is obviously the challenges with governance on chain, but there's also some really beautiful things, right? Basically, it's accessible. It allows anybody with a mobile wallet to basically be able to vote. It allows people who might not have been able to participate in, global wealth opportunities to be able to participate in these protocols. I think this idea of like community capitalism is also very interesting, which is, in many cases, a lot of the people who might invest in like the next project would never have gotten that opportunity if it wasn't for crypto, right? So it's just all these kind of like fun thoughts to think about, which is there are some benefits to kind of maybe highlight to an extent with governance on chain, right? Obviously, the mechanisms in which they're done are things that could be improved, but just the fact that they're on the blockchain can speak some degree of volume to already the additional benefit. One fun piece of content that I wrote when I was kind of a kid in college was that the United Kingdom spent around 25 to 50,000 on pencils for their voting. And I'll send you that link to really verify that later. But I remember that and I'm like, hey, would be kind of cool if voting was on the blockchain. And I know Estonia has some kind of experience there. So that's just been something I've been kind of looking into as a side project and just in the back of my head these days as well. But those are just some of the things that I think are what make kind of this idea of governance on chain special too.
We've covered a lot of good philosophy. Let's land on, what does Utopia Labs do? How is that evolving? What do you do? What do you build? And then how do you see that? Who are some of the clients that are utilizing your tools?
For sure. So, I think the beautiful thing is with Utopia, we're kind of consistently compounding in the way that I think about our mission, our vision, and the progress that we're making from a product perspective to date, right? So when we first started out, when we shipped our test nets and then when we shipped our main net, basically December to January last year, we were specifically and only just a really, really easy way for DAOs and internet communities to use our product on chain to basically send value to anybody else, right? We were a layer on top of Gnosis that was extremely UI and UX friendly, that again made it super easy for these organizations to send value, right? And I think for us, we've been kind of evolving when it comes down to the way we think about our product over time, but that's really what we focused on for basically the past 6 months to a year, which is how do we make it super easy for organizations that are on Gnosis safe to send value seamlessly. As we've been kind of progressing, we've been thinking a lot about this idea of just building extremely useful tools that allow these organizations to be operationally excellent when it comes down to their financial ops, right? We're starting to see that people and companies who use crypto are actually at a disadvantage versus traditional fiat systems. An obvious one could be cost, right? So one thing that we do with our transactions is we bulk send them. Basically what that means is we batch the gas fees all in one single transaction. There's a lot of things that we do to make it as easy to operate on chain as fiat. So that's kind of the way we've been thinking about it, right? So over the past year, we thought a lot about payments, payroll, this idea of even just sending money to contractors. And a lot of DAOs use us, right? So we have Lido, we have Gitcoin, we have Sushi, Olympus, and many of the top DAOs that you might see on sites like DeepDAO, right? And that's kind of the community that we've been able to work with and build with, Friends with Benefits, Pleaser, et cetera. And again, we just made it super easy for these orgs to send value. I think the way we think about our company in the future is to really kind of think about our thesis at a high level. And I think our thesis at Utopia is that we believe that many organizations and several organizations in the future are going to use crypto as their primary rail of sending and settling value. And I think for us, we just kind of want to work towards that thesis that we see in the world, right? And I think it's quite obvious that that's not the case today in regards to the fact that there might not be as many organizations as we want using crypto, right? And I think DAOs were a really, really interesting experiment, specifically because they were a case study of organizations that basically live on the blockchain, right? If you are a DAO, you need to use the blockchain, right? There's almost no compromise from that statement, right? So I think for us, we've just been focused a lot on this kind of small subset or this small market of orgs that completely depend on the blockchain to survive and therefore find a more valuable need for our tool. One fun thing that we're kind of shipping specifically over the next month, and by the time this podcast released, I think the feature will be live, is this idea of what we call insights and transactions, or transactions and insights. So one thing that we're building right now is kind of this idea of a unified financial stack. What does that mean? Well, whenever you execute a payment through Utopia, you have a bunch of really good context or metadata. Basically, when you look at an Etherscan transaction, you're not able to diagnose who, what, when, and why in the context of why you paid and why this Gnosis safe or why this DAO paid this contributor for what, et cetera, right? And I think for us, what we're doing is the blockchains are our first step to this idea of trust and transparency for individuals to obviously agree on a source of truth and a credibly neutral source of truth. But one thing that we're kind of doing for a lot of these internet communities is bringing more transparency and visibility to light. So basically what we're doing is we're allowing any organization that operates on chain that wants to share their real-time financial activity in regards to operational expenditure, burn rate, how much they're spending per category, total inflows and outflows, and being able to embed that and share that financially and publicly. So I think that's kind of like the rough way we've been thinking about, where we started, which was this idea of how do we make it super easy for payroll, this idea of transactions and insights, and then just kind of building throughout as we go. But I do want to say that I think the most important thing building in this market is to being extremely flexible and being extremely close to the customer. So that's kind of the way we've been thinking about our company and the maturation and the life cycle of where we've been and what we're shipping today.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think solving for the way I think about it is the CFO stack for Web3. There's a big investment theme. I think it's still going on for fintech, the CFO stack for fintech, where it's, the Brexes of the world and deal and revenue financing and everything that the finance function in a company would find valuable. And I feel like what you guys are doing fits into, yes, but what if that organization is Web3 native? Can you talk a little bit about raising money for the company and financing the company? Like, I'm guessing this was your first experience putting together a round as an entrepreneur, but you have, as investors, very crypto native funds. Can you talk about that process and what it was like?
I think it actually goes back to this idea of being able to permissionlessly create on the internet. Like if we go back to like the very first question around like me just writing blogs and posting stuff, that's actually how I met our very first kind of like investor. And that's how I got my foot wet when it came down to what fundraising looked like. So maybe a quick story is like before I committed to Utopia and was building Utopia, I traveled 1 week to Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and I just met as many people as I could. Sooner than you expect, I guess, a lot of these people became our angel investors, right? So I kind of went through that entire process of just trying to hustle and get to know people within the Valley and to really kind of just go in and build something that hopefully people wanted. But we met our very first investor, which was Kindred Ventures, in terms of our pre-seed seed round / seed round. And, you know, everything came from that, right? Like just being able to work with a really great fund from the get-go, from the ground up. We were able to then raise from Paradigm for a Series A. And I think for us, again, I think like the reason why we started our company was we wanted to build really important pieces of software to help these internet communities, in which we call DAOs, and this idea of crypto-reliant organizations and companies that operate on crypto rails to find value in our product and to actually streamline the way they think about their back office, right? And I think it relates to your idea of the Web3 CFO stack. So our fundraising journey was, you know, I'm very grateful for our investors and the people that we work with. We also raised from our customers as well. And that was just something that I think aligns a degree to the ethos of why we're even doing what we're doing. I think the one way we think about building software at Utopia is instead of building for a customer, we kind of build with them. And I think obviously you have to pick your time and spot to the way we think about like, you know, not building exactly what the customer wants, but really diagnosing the core problem. But I think that's just been kind of the way we've been thinking about our company. And I think it's kind of a requirement in a space like ours. So that's kind of been like the fundraising history to date. We raised 2 rounds so far and just been heads down ever since as well.
What's your relationship like with your investors? Like, how engaged are they in the direction of the company? And I say this not to be like, oh, some VCs are very hands-on. It's more of a question about, you know, the personality of investors that are exposed to crypto risk and market volatility in the crypto space versus investors that are just, you know, like set it and forget it. This is an equity check into an early stage company. Hope it works out in 7 years. You know, and I kind of like expect early stage crypto venture to be much more like supportive or much more engaged. But I wonder if that's been the experience.
No, for sure it has. I'm really grateful to be a Telegram chat away from a really smart person who can help me out with strategy, right? So I think for us, like the way we kind of think about this is like we like ultimately, I think you have to pivot in terms of strategy, in terms of, you know, a lot of these things much quicker, right? In a market like this, right? The way I think about this is as an entrepreneur, you have to make changes before it's too late, right? And I think, you know, there's just that element of scarcity that I think drives us and to just continuously keep doing what we need to do. But I think from an investor angle, I think I'm very grateful for our investors. Like a lot of them are quite involved. A lot of them participated in what we call our community round of our Series A, and a lot of them give us product feedback. So, you know, ultimately, I think there's a lot of trust as well in terms of the decisions that we make and some of the things that, you know, I think every entrepreneur has to go through hard decisions, right? So summarizing all of that, like, you know, I've found the most positive involvement throughout my entire experience. Again, albeit this is like my very first experience, right? Raising a few rounds and building a company at this scale and doing a lot of these things. So hopefully I'm just here to learn and hopefully I can improve throughout that process. But my experiences have been quite positive and the involvements have been quite solid.
This is a really fascinating conversation, and I'm glad we opened up some of these core topics. If our audience wants to learn more about you or about Utopia, where should they go?
You can find us on Twitter. I believe our handle on Twitter for Utopia Labs is Utopia Labs and then like this weird underscore. So it's like Utopia Labs underscore. So you feel free to follow us there. I'm on Twitter as well. My username is 0xkaito, Kaito. And yeah, that's kind of where you can find us. We're mostly on Twitter.
Fantastic. Kaito, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Lex. I really appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.